Okay, so we'll go ahead and start. This is the panel on cyber operations in a coalition. So I think some of our earlier speakers have talked about some of the challenges in cyberspace, and this panel is going to focus specifically on how do we do this as a team sport with our coalition partners. And we have Ms. Laura Brent here from the international staff at NATO headquarters. Colonel Don Lewis, the CyCON Deputy Director at SHAPE. President Thomas Ilves, former President of Estonia, in addition to an ambassador, member of the European Parliament, several other hats that he's worn in the past. And Ms. Nina Cullers, the Associate Professor of Strategic and Operational Research at the Naval War College. So thank you all for being here. So that, I think, the first thing that we'd like to delve into a little bit are what are some of the realistic expectations, the roles and responsibilities among organizations, particularly when you're considering collective defense in cyberspace, which several of you are intimately involved with. So I think the approach we'd like to take is divide and conquer a bit. So Laura, if you could address what can be done by international organizations such as NATO. Ms. Cullers, if you could discuss what can be done by private industry and companies that are always involved in these efforts. President Ilves, if you can address what could be done by sovereign nations. And Colonel Lewis, if you could address from a military perspective what could be done by organizations such as SHAPE. So I think we'll start with President Ilves.
Right. Well, thank you. It's good to be here at CyCON West, as it were. I've been doing CyCON ever since it was founded, when it was only in Estonia. I think to get really basic about it, first of all, cybersecurity has really underestimated or we have not paid enough attention to the political aspects of doing cyber. The entire paradigm has grown up primarily militarized, but from an espionage paradigm where you never share anything. I mean, you have the Five Eyes, but NATO doesn't share. It's summed up by an experience we had about 10 years ago when we in Estonia discovered a worm and went to NATO and said, oh, look what we found, and the answer was, oh, you too. That is not the response you want to hear from NATO when you're dealing with defense. Meaning that they also knew about this, but we did not know about it. We discovered it on our own. Now, since then, we see that there's been an explosion in all kinds of operations, and sort of following where we have seen only APT 28 and 29 in the past 3 years, the only country in the transatlantic area that I could not find an open source report of something going on with one or the other was Portugal. Every other country has been interfered in one way or another. And importantly, it's all directed politically. I mean, it's not to steal secrets, it's to actually manipulate something, to dox candidates. We saw this not only in the United States in 2016, we saw this with Emmanuel Macron in the French elections of 2017. Intimidation, I mean, basically they hacked into the Bundestag, they hacked into the Italian Foreign Ministry. I mean, some of it's espionage, some of it is simply to get compromising materials. Now, if we face a situation in which every country in Europe, not just NATO, but I mean other countries as well that are non-NATO partners, you would think that there'd be a little more cooperation, because what we end up with is a national response in each case. And dependent upon the capabilities of the individual countries under attack, they're being attacked by the same people, they're using the same methods, yet we have all of these national responses. Now, from a US perspective, we're all very small, and you can probably do all of this much better. From a NATO perspective, all it takes is the weakest link to be compromised. So it is also in the interest of the United States to move in, I would argue, to move in this direction. So far, it's not happening. I mean, it is getting better, but given the seriousness of the threats, and I should throw in here because it's not simply cyber as we know it, but we also, these groups work closely together also with the Internet Research Agency out of St. Petersburg, Russia, and sort of involved in information operations and influence operations. We should not look at these separately, sort of dividing them up. I mean, if Valery Gerasimov sees all of these actions as a continuum, then why should we parse it and think, but okay, that's in that compartment, that's PSYOPs, this is cyber, that's over here, we don't talk to these people over there. This kind of compartmentalization, I would argue, will get us nowhere. So my argument when it comes to these things is the more we work across national boundaries, the more we work across disciplinary boundaries, or the better it is for us. I mean, basically, from my point of view, we look kind of silly. We put our own categories onto things while all these attack vectors are working together in close cooperation, being coordinated by someone, and we're saying, oh no, that's different, or that's that country over there. I'm not even talking about Chinese operations. I'm only talking about, and I'm not talking about Iranian operations. Those all have been, we've seen those too, but that's just the Russian operation insofar as they primarily attack the alliance, members of the alliance, that I talk about that. Ultimately, I think what we will end up seeing, and this is getting very speculative, but I think we will see kind of a division of types of internet and the digital world into, at least into a liberal democratic free internet, and then more authoritarian Chinese, Russian, Iranian, whatever, wherever you have dictatorial governments that want to control information. And the direction what I see ultimately is that we will end up defending the liberal democratic information space, be it cyber, be it information, from those who would like to manipulate it. But I think it's moving in that direction, but we're not there yet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Laura, your thoughts?
Sure. So when I think about this from really a NATO, from an allied perspective, that to me this is sort of complementary and reinforcing to what any individual nation might do when we're thinking about collective defense. So I, again, would think about this maybe in two buckets. So as we just heard, NATO, especially in cyberspace, you can really think about this as only as strong as the weakest link, so that there is a real enduring sense of all allies need to continue to improve in this space. So as an ongoing activity, this sort of first bucket, we can really look to something called the Cyber Defense Pledge, which was announced at Warsaw in 2016. So we're entering the third year of this. So all allies have agreed and pledged to go back and enhance the resilience of their national infrastructures as a matter of priority. So again, that this is something that NATO helps galvanize, that benefits NATO, but also benefits individual allies. What I would also say is that NATO serves as a forum for bilateral and multilateral cooperation and assistance. So not everything needs to happen at 29, but rather that if a particular nation needs assistance in building a particular capability or improving capacity, is that NATO can really help bring specific nations together to do that. And then sort of the second bucket of activities, can be think of as more traditional response activities. So of course, everyone's familiar with Article 5, but Article 4 actually gets a lot less discussion. So Article 4 merely is a formal consultation process that any nation can begin if their political independence, territorial integrity, or security is potentially threatened. So I think that we've seen any number of cyber attacks at this point, that if an ally wanted to, could bring this to the North Atlantic Council, could ask for discussion, could ask for information sharing, could ask for assistance either bilaterally or then through the entirety of NATO. So I think that that's an important and potentially underutilized tool to date. We've seen it been invoked 5 times to date, but never in response to a cyber incident. Then we also see, general sort of solidarity and support from NATO. So the 2 things that jump to mind most recently is after, this is of course not a cyber event, but after the Salisbury attack, that NATO actually more or less expelled 10 Russian diplomats from the Russia mission to NATO. And then after the recent OPCW attack, or the disrupted OPCW attack, is that the Secretary General also came out and publicly expressed solidarity with the Dutch and in line with that incident. Finally, then there is, of course, Article 5. So an attack on one is an attack on all, and I think that this actually is really important to think about when in the cyberspace in particular. So as of 2014 at Wales, allies clearly said that a cyber attack could lead to an Article 5 invocation. But one of the real strengths of NATO is that it's not a cyber alliance only, that really it is a cross-domain, cross-all concerns, so that even if an attack could happen in cyberspace, all tools of the alliance are at the disposal of a response. So again, I think that it's really important to think about the strength of our collective defense is not only just tied to our cyber capabilities. So I think that, those are sort of the ongoing actions, response actions, and does NATO need to continue to improve in this space? Undoubtedly, but really a lot of progress has been made to date to make sure that allies are doing their piece and that NATO is doing its piece as well.
Thank you, Laura. Scholars, how about the commercial piece, industry piece, the easy one?
That's just a real narrow question. So I tend to approach a lot of the cyber conversation from a bottom-up perspective. So looking at the state of play just in hacking writ large, just in the dark markets and the light markets. So the way in which I look at this challenge tends to be a little bit more from the private sector and individual approach. And so, and what I can say to that is how do we then go from that space all the way up to something as aggregated and as global sort of sovereignty related as something like NATO. And it's a stretch for anybody working in my space, and it's even a greater stretch for firms. But we do know that private sector firms, whether they're producing hardware or software, whether they're doing the networking or the machines, that the attacks happen to them first and most often. And so for this to watch the firms, for the private industry, the private sector, to deal with these kinds of exploits and breaches is a day-to-day endeavor, and they understand it as that, not as a state-on-state endeavor, although there are security firms that do specialize, for instance, CrowdStrike or Mandiant, do specialize in state-on-state analysis. For the private sector, this is an everyday occurrence, and for the private sector, the vast majority of these attacks are about money. And I think one of the hardest parts about tackling this problem from a state-on-state perspective is recognizing the hybridity of the challenge, that most of these attacks are criminal in nature. Most of these attacks are about money. Most of these attacks are about theft, about how can I resell this data, right? And on top of that, that's when states get involved. Now, they may direct it, or they may just passively allow it to be the case, right? This is the Chinese case. This is, in many cases, the North Koreans, right? The North Korean hacking teams, they're allowed to, as they call, eat what they kill, right? So if they knock over a system, they take the information out of it, and if they make some money along the way, good for them. So there's a hybridity to this that makes it harder because not only are you dealing with country-to-country relationships and military joint operations across borders, but you're also dealing with Department of Justice policing efforts, which is really, for the United States, has been a very, very hard case for us to deal with. We're not accustomed to doing this. And so that's been one of the tricks. Is the collaboration getting better? Yeah, I mean, I think it is getting better. Private sector all by itself is learning how to pass information, not just across. They've been doing that for a very long time. But they're trying to figure out how to pass up and how to expect information back. And it was just most recently, I think it was Cyber Command that uploaded a bunch of malware samples to VirusTotal, if you're familiar with VirusTotal at all. And so that notion of understanding where threats are coming from and then trying to share that with the remainder of the community who's been sharing for a very long time has been a really encouraging turn. The one space we haven't matured into, firms or I think intellectually countries all around, is that data leakage. Right now, data leakage is understood as protect the crown jewels. If you are a firm and you have information, you have customers you're trying to protect and trying to seal off from the rest of the world, protect your crown jewels. Get a security firm, get secure, get your firewall set, get your architecture set. Okay? The problem is, and there've been a couple games that were run by Cyberspace up in Boston, is that what you consider your crown jewels, your information that's important to protect your business, might not be the information that's going to make somebody downstream from you vulnerable or upstream from you vulnerable. So if you think of the case of the health trackers and military bases, right? From the firm's perspective, they're protecting their customer, right? But the data that comes out of those technologies makes a whole other set of folks vulnerable. And so now we don't just have to think about how to protect each of these domains, but how do you then go up and down the chain? And how do you protect everybody that's upstream and downstream from you? That's going to be the next set of challenges. And I don't know how we're going to solve it. And then just as a final note, to this question of politics, I think that everyone's struggling with this question of politics. And so it was this last year at Black Hat when Dark Tangent opened all of Black Hat and said, look, the attacker only really has to succeed. And the defender has to start with politics, which means even if you're a person working at Microsoft or Google, from the moment the attack begins, from the moment the breach is recognized, you have to turn to your board and ask the question, what can we do? What's the proper order of things? Do we even tell anybody about this, right? Everybody has to go through this, so their politics are internal to their institutions, but everyone's having this political problem. I wholeheartedly agree.
So Colonel Lewis, how do you take these kinds of considerations into account when you're conducting or planning operations with an organization such as SHAKE?
I have no idea. We've talked a lot this morning, in many of the presentations about who the enemy is, who the adversary is, and they talked about, I actually learned that in addition to Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, Taylor Swift is also a big player in the cyberspace fight. But I'll do something that you might not expect me to do as the uniform member of this panel, and I'll talk about the internal struggle from a roles and responsibilities perspective. And I'm here to tell you that the struggle is real. I thought it was difficult to figure out how to do cyber just within the United States Air Force, going to NATO and learning all about how business is done in a coalition of 29, or in some cases less than 29, is an entirely new level of complexity. What I do know is I know when I hear an order, right? As a military person, and you young military people, you understand that, right? So what I heard the heads of state say when they said operationalize cyber and defend it as effectively as you do air, land, and the maritime environment, I know exactly what that means. And being military, I'm a control freak. So tell me what I can command and control and give it to me and let me do my thing. I'll defend it. And then I had somebody from Brussels say to me, hey, when the heads of state said that, they didn't mean to operationalize all of cyber. They only want you to defend the stuff that you need to conduct allied operations and missions. And I said, so you want us to cut water? Because ones and zeros don't care. And especially in an alliance that operates as complex as NATO does, a lot of the systems that are used for allied operations and missions are the same boxes and wires and routers and things that we use for other missions in NATO, to include the incredibly important mission of consultation. And if you don't want the knuckle-dragging uniformed people to defend that stuff, who's going to defend it? The lexicon is important when you're talking about roles and responsibilities. There's a difference between cybersecurity and cyber defense. Everybody does cybersecurity. Everybody has to do cybersecurity. It's incredibly important. Every nation, every government, every commercial entity, every non-government organization, if you have a network, you have to protect it or you won't have a network for long. But those are a collection of processes and tactics and tools that are used to keep the information that traverses and resides on your network safe. You have to do that. You do that at the tactical level. You do that at the technical level. Cyber defense is treating cyberspace, the operational domain of cyberspace, the same way that you treat the other domains. So you don't try to do things new. You take cyberspace and you fit it into the machinery that already exists, that NATO has been doing for its entire existence. And that way you don't confuse your senior decision makers. You bring to the table the same information that professionals in the other domains bring to the table and tell them, here's how you defend this, here's how you reach that objective, here's how you achieve this effect, here's how you make sure you can achieve your objectives when you don't have that asset or this asset. That's what's important. And technicians can't do that. The people with the fingers on the keyboards can't do that. Operators do that. The people who are trained in military tactics techniques, it's no different. If you know something about operations, I can teach you enough cyber stuff to make you operate in a place like the CyOC. If you know something about cyberspace, you know something about CIS provision, we can teach you operations. Our nations have been doing that for centuries. It's not as complicated as it looks on the surface. And yet, when you're talking about making sure that the right hand is coordinated with the left hand, it can sometimes get incredibly complicated.
Thank you. You know, General Stewart mentioned this concept of persistent engagement this morning and the activities that occur in cyberspace below the threshold of conflict. I wonder if you could each kind of comment on that and some of the implications for things like rules of engagement, operation capabilities, force posture, from your perspectives. And President Ilves, I'd appreciate particularly your perspective from a political perspective, and Colonel Lewis, perhaps, particularly on the information preparation of the battle space aspects of it. And Nina, perhaps on this dynamic in which instruments of national power can be degraded over time through the cumulative effects of things like intellectual property theft or theft of weapon systems, associated data. And then Laura, I think I'll give you the final word on effects that would undermine social cohesion through social media and similar aspects. So President Ilves.
Well, I think we still need to rethink many things simply because the traditional categories of defense have disappeared in the cyber for a number of reasons. Beginning with, say, the lack, or I mean the firewall that exists traditionally between the private sector and the public sector is meaningless in an era when in fact the companies that produce software are transnational, maybe more transnational than NATO. When in fact the attackers are attacking private sector products, but I mean, what can you share with the government? What the government is willing to share with you? I mean, these are all issues that face every single country. Then again, another side of this leakage, or what you call the eat what you kill. I mean, I call what the Russians and the Chinese have done a unique form of public-private partnership. You basically have mafioso hackers who are being paid by the government to do things. And we even know, at least back before 2014, that there was an agreement between the FSB and mafioso groups, hacking groups in Ukraine. The deal was that you don't do anything in the territory of the former Soviet Union except for the Baltic states. We don't prosecute you if you do something outside that area, our area. And should we ever need you, you will come and work for us. I mean, this is going back to like Genghis Khan, I would say. I mean, and we're still thinking in terms of the traditional post-Westphalian notion of state borders and so forth. I would add one more thing to make it even worse, is that maybe NATO is not the appropriate organization to deal with this, which I'm not saying. I love NATO. I spent years trying to get into NATO. However, if you think of what is force, force is mass times acceleration. Acceleration is meters per second squared. Since force up till then, up till cyber, has always been an issue of kinetic warfare, where things in NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because it comes down to defending the North Atlantic space, and that comes down to tank logistics, fighter plane ranges, refueling. Today, distance means nothing, absolutely nothing when it comes to an attack in cyberspace. And time, well, the speed of light is almost instantaneous, so we can counter that. So there is no geographical rationale at this point for NATO. The rationale should be rather political, common values, a common space, which may include Australia and Japan and South Korea. It is not anymore the traditional fighting space that in 1949 was the basis for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'm not saying we have to get rid of anything, but we might have to think in new categories that because of the private sector element and because of the new definition of force, that we have to think in new ways and not be restricted by the kind of traditional rules that have developed over 70 years as a result of, constant negotiation, the product of constant negotiation, all thinking about things like the Fulda Gap rather than thinking about this cyberspace thing. So this is why and what it comes out in practical terms is the NATO Cyber Center in Tallinn, Estonia, and this is also true in the information space on the Strategic Communications NATO Center in Riga, is that they can only deal with NATO issues. That is, if an individual country is attacked, neither center can do anything about it. They can say, oh, that's interesting. But it's not in the sense of they're restricted. So, in fact, you will see reports on how many attacks there are on the NATO organization, as an organization, not on, there were all these attacks on France. And this is where we are today, is that we are restricted, I think, by paradigms that worked fine for kinetic warfare, tanks and planes, but for us, not anymore.
Thanks, sir. Colonel Lewis?
When you're talking about prepping the battlefield, the whole idea is to get left of boom, right? You want to be prepared before something bad happens. But could you imagine prepping a battlefield where it's already been mined, there's grenades flying, there's rockets flying, everything's blowing up, and you're just showing up and you're trying to get started. That's no way to fight an engagement, and you are not going to win that engagement. So in cyberspace in particular, most of the work has to be done way left of boom. That's where we make our money. In NATO, we talk about the full spectrum of operations. We talk about BACO, which is baseline operations, that's day to day. And then we at some point, a decision is made by the political sphere that we've entered into a crisis, and then maximum level of effort, which is all-out war. If you're trying to figure out how to fight in cyber in any of the last two, you've already lost. Not just the cyber fight, you've probably lost the entire fight. So it's important that you have a good understanding of, from a military perspective, what your uniformed force can do way before bad things happen, overt bad things happen. If you were fortunate enough to hear General Renner's speech this morning, he told you that cyberspace is always on. It's critically important that SACEUR knows what he's authorized to do by the nations and what he can delegate down to his subordinate commanders, down to General Renner, down to the SIOC ahead of time, because that's where we have to do all the heavy lifting. That's a difficult proposition, I think, for some people in NATO to accept, because it's an alliance with 29 votes, and 28 does not cut it. So to get them to, before something bad happens, agree, I'm going to let you do this, without fully understanding the implications of those things is a tough thing to sell. But that's what we're trying to do right now, is get them to understand that if we don't have these decisions pre-made, we're not gonna be successful. And everybody has to agree that that's the way things are gonna be done, because there's no time for negotiation in cyberspace. To fight in cyberspace, you don't have to move aircraft battle groups and squadrons of airplanes and tanks to the place that you want to fight. It happens like that, and you have to know what it is that you're going to do well beforehand.
Thank you. Ms. Collars, what about this concept of using cyber means to affect the balance of power over time? You wake up and you're in a totally different strategic environment.
That's, so this is I've only started thinking my way through this space, so I'll say something maybe bold and then I can walk it back later on, I suppose. But my concern with watching the United States and its allies respond to what we call the return to great power conflict, right? This is everyone's and there was more than enough of my colleagues and plenty of enough military advisors who were super excited to get back into a time of great power conflict, because it meant you could move your level of analysis up 3 and look at country v. country again. And for many people, that was a relief to move back to that space. But I would like to remind people that just because we're back to great power conflict did not then mean we're returning to conventional warfare. So we can't rely just on military overmatch in terms of conventional weapons. That is not how I see Russia and China posturing. The activities, the below the threshold, the left of boom, that any great power out there worth its salt would not meet us on the battlefield now or for the next 10 to 15 years conventionally. That's stupid. So what they're going to do instead is continue to degrade us in these tiny ways, in these confusing ways through the private sector, stealing information that makes it harder for us to sell our stuff overseas, right? We have to figure out how to get more creative with the way we're responding to these things, which may then mean that it's outside the military lane. It might well mean that it's up to the Federal Trade Commission. It might well mean that it's up to scholars. It might well mean that it's not the lane of the military to do so. And that's really hard to accept. When you think about great power conflict, you think military. I just want to push a little and say, is that the right ordering of things? Or do we need to be thinking about other ways to respond to these kinds of constant pokes? It's death by 1,000 cuts. So I just wanted to, sort of throw that out there for you. And I also wanted to second this conversation about, again, criminal organizations, transnational organizations, individuals. Like, we were all happy to move past that moment too and not have to think about small groups anymore. The Russian capacity to do botnets was built out of organized crime in Russia. So Brian Krebs's book, Spam Nation, traces this back to early 2000s, 2003, 2004, when everyone's getting Cialis ads as spam in their email box. Those were Russian criminal syndicates trying to sell either real or fake international drugs. And plenty of Americans bought them. That's where the Russians learned how to use their botnets.
And then what they did was they turned inverted the bots into DDoS attacks on my country.
So again, we are correct to focus on great power conflict. It is the right vision for a nation-state to nation-state interaction. But it is not going to be about, I don't think it's going to be about conventional warfare for quite some time.
So Laura, whenever something happens at NATO, one of the first considerations is solidarity and the fundamental aspect of the alliance and presenting a united front to any potential adversaries as part of its raison d'etre. So what about the potential for cyber means to be used to try to put a wedge between allies or undermine that social cohesion that underpins the alliance?
So I would say that I think, Peter Singer's talk this morning probably did far more effectively discuss, what we can actually see in more of the social media space, more of this non-traditional space than, perhaps I could in a couple minutes. But, would maybe take a little bit of a step back for a moment and just say, obviously what's happening now is destructive and disruptive. But to your point, Nina, we're not yet at conflict. So there is benefit to repeated interaction. We can improve our own defenses, change adversary behavior. There is still time before there is true traditional conflict. So, there is space in here to potentially think through some of these problems to change behaviors, et cetera. So I would say, one of the first things that comes to mind is, the Talon Manual. Both versions 1 and 2 have done a lot of thinking about how does international law apply? What should the rules of the road really be? And that's a great start. And now we need states to really actually make international law because it is states who do that. So the UK Attorney General recently spoke very eloquently and at length about what the UK really considers appropriate behavior in this space. The US continues to message and continues to advance its strategy on what it will accept and what it will not accept. So I think that these kind of actions can continue to really sort of change this environment. But with this space of continued interaction, what really strikes me is that this now needs to become one of resilience. Whether that's actual true cyber defense network resilience or really to, your question, really more social and political resilience. And how do we do that? I think it is extremely challenging, but what strikes me most from this morning's talk is that to remember that a lot of this is actually a cyber-enabled problem, not necessarily just a cyber-only problem. So what experts do we really need in the room? I certainly am unqualified to talk about information operations, whereas some people have made their whole careers doing this. So whom do we really bring to the table to make sure that this isn't ultimately effective? How do we effectively educate people? How do we make sure that you do have the benefit of having 29 allies sitting around the table that even if you might disagree on a particular issue or it might be contentious, that you're not doing so in isolation, that you can continue to perhaps argue or disagree, but in a more constructive format. So I think that while I'm sure we would all wish that we were not experiencing the level of malicious activity that we are, there is opportunity to continue to shape this space.
Thank you. With that, I think we'll go to questions.
Can I just add a few things?
I'm sorry, Mr. President?
I would say that I'm really about this sort of trying to think out of the box in this realm because clearly thinking in traditional military ways is not really helping or not doing its job. One thing, my colleague Amy Ziegart in Stanford has pointed out that in cyber deterrence, deterrence may not be the right model. Deterrence is making the outcome of an attack so bad for the other guy that they won't do it. Whereas maybe we should think in terms of crime, where the goal is to make sure that every incident is responded to and punished. And that is much more the cyber realm. When we think about our toolbox, far be it for the former president of Study to say anything bad about the Italian manual. However, maybe that's the wrong realm. Maybe what you ought to do is every time you get an attack that you can pretty much ascribe to a bad actor, the head of state in that country suddenly finds that his offshore money has decreased. It's a no-brainer to go into Vladimir Putin's bank accounts and decrease them. I mean, you want to make them to stop this, and you want them to know that if you do this, you will have something happen to you. And I mean, why do they deposit their money abroad? Because it's safe there. Well, maybe you say your money isn't safe. I mean, I'm not saying that is the sole solution, but I think we need to think in other ways than simply that, okay, if you do this, then we will do something which is in the same domain, which is to the same degree. Our goal is to stop this behavior. And so far, we're not doing a good job of it, so maybe we ought to try something else and think somewhat out of the box and in terms of this as crime rather than as deterrence.
Thank you. Question number 1.
Good afternoon. I'm Cherry Jung from the Naval Academy, and this question is open to all the panelists. In a geopolitical standpoint, who has the upper hand in cyber warfare, offense or defense?
Volunteers?
Geopolitical.
In a geopolitical construct, who has the upper hand, offense or defense? I would say the answer is situational, dependent upon the engagement. If you're prepared for the engagement, from a defensive standpoint, you have the upper hand. Thinking back again to one of the other presentations this morning, I mean, we don't have a cyber problem. The presenter said, we have a nation-state problem. So it's not new from that perspective. So a defensive-minded organization that can repel it wins. An unprepared or uncoordinated organization is always going to fall victim to an offensive attack. But again, from a military standpoint, all we can do is control the terrain, right? We can't control the effect once it's delivered. Cyberspace doesn't exist without IT. It exists because we have networks, because we have boxes, because we have wires, because we have spectrum. But it doesn't mean anything unless there's a person who receives information at the far end of it. And I think that's one way that some of our adversaries have approached the problem in a very brilliant way, recognizing that it's not enough to operationalize the cyberspace domain. What you're really trying to do is operationalize the cognitive domain.
And if I might add also for a minute, that I would say that, again, this is really a cross-domain problem. So if this is truly at the level of warfare, that it's not just a cyber problem, that it is a nation-state problem, it is a conflict problem, and that cyber is obviously at this point hugely key. So if you haven't thought through how you're either going to play offense or defense in this space, you're going to be at a disadvantage. But to think about this only as, I think, cyber capabilities is, again, perhaps a bit dangerous. Obviously talking above the threshold of conflict.
And one of the surprises of, say, 20 years ago was realizing that very sort of individual actors or very minor groups can do huge damage. And this would obviously give the advantage to the aggressor. Now, if you think in terms of, say, the Tahrir Square and the sort of Egyptian events of 2011, everyone said, wow, Weil go him at, and sitting out there in Silicon Valley can get all this news spread and really take down a government. And then you find out, and then you realize that actually governments who are looking at this asymmetry, bad actors, said, wow, we can do this too. And that's, I think, what we saw as a result of the Tahrir Square actions by a small group of individuals for the good became what we begin to see in 2015, 2016, which is the operationalization of cyber to go into the political domain. And then you see that they have the offense has a huge advantage. But they have one disadvantage, which is they never know where they will be hit back. So this does bring it back to the Clausewitzian concept of it's the once the aggressor attacks into someone else's sovereign territory, from there on in, he's in a defensive war because he never knows where he's going to be attacked. And so I think we ought to, again, take it to that Clausewitzian level, or that concept that you start hitting them. And so then the defense has the advantage, because you just have to make clear there's a concrete connection between what the aggressor did in one place and the fact that maybe suddenly the banking system is down. I mean, they have to be made explicit.
I just want to do a 10-second response on this. I want to turn the question just a little bit. One, there can never be a panel for Army without someone mentioning Clausewitz, so that's been served. But two...
I'm not Army, I'm civilian.
No, but this is AC. So two, I guess the thing is if you want to think purely in terms of networks, China has done a remarkable job of continuing to build a regime-preserving network system. The United States has created its networks to favor businesses, firms, capitalism, industry. But China has thought its way to, how do I create a network, an information system that's going to preserve my regime? And that's turning the question a little bit, but I think maybe if it gets you more useful thoughts.
Thank you. Next question.
So this was my question, though. Thank you very much. I guess we all agree that cyberspace is a challenging environment. Definitely true. Though there is also maybe the need for a comprehensive approach, is what I got from the panel. But I would really like to you, Mr. President, to enlighten me a bit more. How would you like to orchestrate it? So I had kind of a, let's say, problems to resolve, but how to resolve, would really like or ask you to share your ideas, especially if you look in the international approach. Thank you.
Well, I have a piece in Internationale Politik auf Deutsch in January, and also it's in English in the Berlin Policy Journal from January, where I argue that we have to look at liberal democracies and how the rest of them are at this point and try to defend those. That means we need not only NATO, but we need actually the European Union to start seriously dealing with these things, because they're not. And it has to include informational warfare, which Federica Mogherini has basically put her head into the sand and not done. We need to bring in Australia, New Zealand, need to bring in Uruguay, whoever qualifies as a serious democracy, because those are the ones who are under the asymmetric threat of disruption of democratic elections. And that should be the criteria, because you're not going to, it's an asymmetric threat because you're not going to disrupt elections in Russia. Not going to happen. I think the 74% result that Vladimir Putin got in March, that was determined already through focus groups in September of last year. You're not going to disrupt elections in China or Iran. It's not going to happen. So we have to so they have a complete asymmetric advantage against us, using all these things that we could never use against them, either morally or even just looking at effects. So let's get the countries that are real democracies, sit down and say, look, and talk seriously. Say, these are the problems. We can sort of dispense with all of the all the niceties that we always have in international meetings, and that are always in the beginning and end of every statement by every head of state, and say, look, we have to get serious because liberal democracy is under threat from authoritarian regimes who are basically using the information space and cyber to destroy our way of life.
Sir.
Sang Bay, United States Naval Academy, this question is open to the entire panel. So there have been attempts to settle on international law, the Talon Manual, the two versions, but I was wondering how you're going to reconcile the fundamental different views on cyberspace as an instrument of power for all of these regimes, such as Russia, China, their view of how they would like to use cyber is different from ours. So how do we get them to reconcile and actually agree to an international law?
You don't. I'll tell you frankly, their view of cyber defense includes information security, which basically means their right to censor the internet. You're not going to get agreement on this. This is why I do not see, I mean, as much as we would like to see this, you know, kumbaya, the entire world comes together and says we're not going to do anything bad. Unfortunately, they are the ones who I mean, their line, and it has been true at the UN through UNGA for years, is that sort of what the content of internet is something that has to be regulated by us. And the democracies are never going to agree to have Russia and China and Iran decide what is on the internet.
I think he just bombed the hell out of them. Yeah. I'm an Air Force guy, I can't help myself. Media, that was a joke.
These views do not necessarily represent the...
It's a really good question, right? Because it's kind of the heart of the matter. If you can't respond in kind, then you have to find what is it that does influence them. What is it that they do care about? And I think we need to answer that question. The meddling of elections. What's more offensive as an American, right? Than having a foreign entity mess with the fundamentals of democracy, what our nation is founded on. And you know, I again, speaking only for myself, I'd have to say that it's pretty effective strategy. Just look at the results of last week, how close some of these votes are. And I also think there's it's a gift that keeps on giving, right? I mean, there's such a divide right now based off of what happened 2 years ago. It seems to have manifested itself in us destroying ourselves.
And not just the United States. I mean, this is true. The French election, the Czech election, the Italian election. I mean, you can go on and on about where there has been outside manipulation. I mean, clearly in the Czech election, I'm no longer in office, so I can say anything I want. It was clearly that the far better serious candidate had a frontal assault from the Russians and turned him into a pariah. And he just lost by a little bit. And the guy the incumbent, is kind of a xenophobic, populist, and he won, though no one predicted he would. So this affects countries across the board, unfortunately, not just the United States.
Yes, sir. And I think as an alliance, although right now we can't do anything like this, but I can see the day where we do have an operation that is conducted exclusively in cyber, potentially to combat something like election meddling. If enough of the allies say enough, we're going to draw the line here, we can do exactly how we conduct operations in the Mediterranean. This country's in the lead. These countries are supporting right now. In 3 months, we'll rotate out. Hey, here's the good news. You don't have to ship any ships over there or planes. You can do this from your home station. Let's develop an O plan. Let's define the roles and responsibilities, and let's get at it. Let's make them stop that behavior.
I would add one more thing. I mean, given what we were talking about before, about sort of the public-private partnership, and you have all these bad actors. I mean, we've actually seen this in U.S. history. In fact, it's enshrined in the Marine hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. What was going on in Tripoli? There were privateers who were basically splitting up the money with the Sultan, or whatever he was, in Istanbul or Constantinople or whatever you called it. And so they went after. I mean, this didn't come under international law. The U.S. just went after them and got the Barbary pirates because they were attacking Americans. Well, you do the same thing with these groups, right? So think of the Marine hymn every time you wonder about it.
You know, and I would say, too, what's interesting, I think, about your question is, you know, the UNGGE process, so the group of governmental experts, you know, the last one the most recent one failed, but the one before that did come to agreement, which said international law applies in cyberspace. You know, so nations agreed to that. Obviously, I would say our conceptions perhaps are not all the same of what international law is. But again, I would say that, there are tools that exist. If meddling in elections happened with physical people in countries the way that it is done in a cyber-enabled way, nations would not be accepting this. So I think it's important to think through that we are still not in a place where we are comfortable necessarily either responding in kind or responding in another domain in a way that's been effective to stop this behavior. But before deciding that there needs to be a new regime, a new legal regime of what's appropriate behavior, what's not, that we need to think through the tools and think about what still applies. And further, I think that as Western liberal democracies, at some point we're going to have to accept that potentially all the tools of our adversaries might not be available to us because we do not believe that is, morally appropriate. Does that mean we have to accept it? Absolutely not. But again, responding in kind is something to be careful of.
There's a question back here.
This one,
I'm sorry, over here.
the paddle guy.
Major Mike Lovell, U.S. Army North. We've heard a lot about weaknesses and inefficiencies of the coalition this morning. What are some of the strengths of the coalition? And of those strengths, are they traditional strengths of the coalition, or are they strengths that we found through the constant pressure of competition in cyberspace?
You want to go first?
Sure. There's nothing like having a bunch of strong friends, ready to come to your aid. And one of the greatest things about the coalition is you don't have to be very specific in how you will respond to aggression. In fact, as it applies to the operational domain of cyberspace, there's value in being ambiguous. NATO has said, for its entire existence, you attack one, you attack us all, we will respond. As it applies to cyberspace, it says an attack in cyberspace can trigger an Article 5 response, period, end of sentence. And there's a deafening silence at the end of that sentence, in that it didn't say specifically what would have to happen to trigger that Article 5 response. And that's because you don't want to let some of these adversaries know where the line is, because you know what they'll do. They'll go right up to it and make sure that it doesn't incur the wrath of the coalition. The other thing that is real interesting in how NATO, has approached this is it says, hey, we're defensive. We've always been defensive. That is our charter. So we will not attack you in cyberspace, but my burly friend over here will, right? So don't think that there won't be repercussions if you attack us, because then you deal with all 29. And there's some pretty capable fighters among those 29.
We don't know about a lot. The public does not know about a lot of stuff, but actually if you Google and look up what the Dutch did to protect the State Department several years ago, but the article only appeared this year in Volkskrant, the Dutch newspaper, but it's been written up in English as well. Basically how the Dutch found out that the State Department was being attacked. They even got so far as they had hacked the cameras of the Russian GRU hackers who were doing this, and there was this ongoing battle between state and the GRU hackers trying to get into the State Department system, and the Dutch were the ones who tipped off, first warned the US about this, and later on actually watched the operation through the cameras and not on the computer, but they had actually managed to get into the CCTV that was in the building of the GRU. So, this is an example of the kind of stuff that goes on and will only come out if it's decided that, this is a cool story and we'll let it be known. But there's a lot of that.
And what I would also say is that NATO is obviously perhaps sometimes slower than some would like to come to a decision, but when a decision is taken, it has the force then of 29 nations. I would also say that, interestingly, I think it is more flexible than sometimes we give it credit for, in terms of Article 5 has only been invoked once, and that was after 9/11. And I don't think that anyone, when NATO was set up, thought that 9/11 would be the kind of attack or the nation that would potentially be invoking Article 5. So I think that in this space, the strength of the alliance is it has continued to respond over now almost 70 years and will continue to do so. That's at sort of a political and strategic level. And from a more practical sort of operational level, that I think actually having 29 different, slightly different legal systems and such actually does provide a lot of insights and a lot of potential best practices for nations. That I've sat in some of these meetings where different allies are talking about how they've approached specific problems, and potentially in the US that the way, whether it's Title 10 and Title 50 or any other authorities work, wouldn't potentially be applicable, to us, but to other allies who are trying to grow specific programs, who are trying to advance, whatever capabilities, that there is a lot of learning to be done. So, I think there is absolutely strength in any number of different examples and practice, and there is ultimately strength, even if it takes perhaps longer than, sometimes some would like to get to a decision, the strength of then all 29 willing to back that up, in any situation.
Sir.
Ladies, gentlemen, Cadet Jonathan Trout, United States Military Academy. My question is for anyone who wants to answer it. It was discussed earlier that countries, like specifically within NATO, should assist one another in building up their cyber infrastructure. But at what point does that collaboration jeopardizes one's nation's national security? Thank you.
So, sorry, could you clarify maybe a little bit? What do you mean by jeopardize their own national security?
As in, you mentioned that nations should collaborate with one another to build up their cyber infrastructure. Within that, I'm sure there'll be various means of secret information that will be distributed.
Okay.
And so, whether or not they're your allies, at what point does that, just them having it, jeopardize your own national security?
So I like to talk about the two I's, right? Capital I, intelligence, which is sovereign, right? That's something that's produced by a nation that you have to go through an RFI process to get, right? Then there's the lowercase I, which is information, which is a lot easier to share, and you don't have to rely upon nations to get that. There's tons of it available from commercial entities, from the industry, and both of them are incredibly important to creating situational awareness. Where it gets hard is where sharing the capital I leads to a question like, how do you know that? And that's why it's difficult to get 29 nations, in the case of NATO, to agree upon the terms, this is what I'm going to share, this is what I'm not going to share. Again, it's going to be situational. So there has to be a level of trust, but nations like to verify. That's the sticky wicket. That's the difficult thing to figure out. But I think we can do it. We have figured out how to do it in the nuclear enterprise. We have figured out how to do it in the special operations field. And sometimes that requires operating in a less than 29 environment using need to know principles. So again, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Use the mechanisms that are already in place to make this work.
And the other thing I would maybe clarify for a moment. So earlier I was talking about the Cyber Defense Pledge, and again, the potential for bilateral and multilateral cooperation. So the pledge is a pretty high-level political document. There are 7 objectives, which are actually public if you go find them, but they're really around trying to figure out how nations are resourcing cyber defense or doing information sharing or doing education and training. So this is not just, more mill-to-mill kind of stuff, but sort of the entire range of more civil society kinds of questions as well. And so when I'm talking about nations having the opportunities to potentially bilateral and multilaterally assist each other, that's even as something as simple as, how do you do forensics effectively? How do you set up an appropriate program at your military academy to make sure that there is a pipeline of educated officers? Things like that. So I think, as Don was just saying, of course, when you're talking intelligence and, sharing sensitive capabilities, of course that would come into play. But I think that there is a lot of sharing of, not even necessarily defensive tools, but even just practice that there is a fruitful environment to continue to do that without, really coming up against any of those kinds of issues.
So the different models so we're at the front end, so the private sector shares information all the time, and that's just a function of having to survive in this environment. And we're talking about firm to firm or security firm to security firm, right? And these, we're talking about the collaboration across money-making companies. So it is entirely possible, even though they don't have mutual interests. It's entirely possible, even though they're competitive against one another. The question is really not if to share, but the question is what's the model of sharing you're looking for? And so it's at what level, right? And so the question of intelligence is not one that they play with so often in InfoSec, but it's what are your best practices and how do you pick the right person to have those conversations? Because frankly, the InfoSec people want nothing to do with this conversation. They don't because it doesn't come to their degree of technicality. So if you think of it specifically as how do I make my system safer? How do I make my network safer? I want to talk to your network people and your network people, and we're going to share. And this is the concept early on out of Carnegie Mellon. There's the the computer emergency response teams that were born, and they go country to country, teaching other countries how to do emergency response, sharing best practices. And there are lots of really good examples of what they call CERT teams, internationally sharing information, before countries have agreed to do so. And so it happens a lot at the lower levels. When you're talking about the upper strategic levels, it gets a little more hairy, but there's good news down there.
So before we conclude here, I just wanted to give the panelists one opportunity. It's been about 1 minute apiece, and just on their final thoughts. We'll just go down the road here.
So I think I would also go back to maybe Dmitry Alperovich's briefing this morning of the idea that we don't have a cyber problem is that we have a geopolitical nation-state problem. And I think that for NATO, that's an important thing to continue to bear in mind, that this is absolutely a challenge that we have taken seriously, that we need to continue to do so. We first took a technical approach to this back in 2002 with the creation of equivalent, essentially our CERT, to now 16 years later that we have a Cyberspace Operations Center, that we have said Article 5 could be invoked. So we have made both technical and political progress, but certainly our work isn't done. And that we need to continue to really approach this from a perspective of how is this directly related and integrated and affected and enabled by our core mission, so of defending the 29 allies, so that this is both a technical and political challenge, and that not to lose sight of the larger geostrategic environment in which we have and will need to continue to adapt in.
I'd like to address the young officers or soon-to-be officers in the room and just share with you how jealous I am of you, especially those of you who are going to enter into the cyber operations field. When I was a second lieutenant, my colonel said to me during a conversation, "Hey, I got news for you, Don. You're never going to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force." 27 years later, I recognize the wisdom of that statement. But what he was saying was, as someone who was operating in the support side of the house, there was no clear path to a chair that's always held by an operator. Something really interesting happened last week in the United Kingdom. They announced that they are reconstituting the 11th Group. And if you look in your history books, they played a significant role in the defense of Britain in World War II. But they changed it. It's now a multidiscipline, multi-domain group in which a single commander has air, maritime, land, and cyber assets all at his command and control, going the opposite direction that most of our nations, all of our nations, have gone with a domain-focused approach. And it's recognition that to be effective, a commander has to understand intimately all of the different risks associated and the ways to leverage all aspects of all the domains. Everything is hybrid now. Almost nothing is conducted in a single domain. And you're going to have an opportunity to influence that and take part in that. So I wish you luck.
I would extend that a bit. I think we have to think much more out of the box. And if we think about most of what cyber has been up till now, it has been thinking in sort of a different domain about what we had for 60 years or 50 years in the Cold War, that they would come and destroy us. And so we think about, oh my God, they're going to take down our electricity net, our power grid, all these horrible things. I don't think they want to do that. At least I don't think the Russians want to do that. They need the West. They need the West because that's where there's rule of law and where their bank accounts are safe. And that is what the political leadership of at least that adversary is concerned about, is keeping their assets safe, which they know they can't in their own country. Even if you're Vladimir Putin, you put money into Fonseca in Panama. But they want political control. They want governments that will break up NATO. They want governments that will break up the European Union. You see their actions in Montenegro right before Montenegro decided to join. I mean, you see this over and over again. They want political control. That means we have to think far more in terms of the information warfare directed at changing the political order, creating political chaos in the West, but not just strictly of, my God, they're going to devastate us because all the electricity will go out.
That was grim. I guess I'll just speak to the thing I think we haven't spoken about much, but is sort of implied by the sponsors in this space, which is the future workforce that's going to be doing InfoSec and cybersecurity. From the perspective that I approach and look at growing the workforce, the United States is not growing it fast enough and appears not to be thinking carefully about how to grow it robustly, which means that we're going to have to rely on our allies and their workforce more and more until we can figure out how to grow ours. Right now, the people doing the lion's share of vulnerability research, just at that lowest possible level, are from India. They're doing 30% of our vulnerability research for us. That's weird, right? So we need to either think about how to grow our workforce faster or how to figure out good ways to have them do good, secure work for us until we can get there. It's a huge problem. I'm not certain that information operations will continue to be used in exactly this way in the future. I think that we may learn our way out of social media, hopefully. But I think this workforce problem is going to be a big one, and so if some people could get work on that, that'd be great.
Thank you.
And before he takes the microphone back from us, on behalf of the panel, because he didn't introduce himself, I'd like to thank Mr. Tom Strickland from the Institute of Defense Analysis for being our moderator today. Great job, Tom.
Thank you.